parpadeo de las luces que a lo lejos van marcando mi retorno.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Blu-ray Boutique. I'm your co-host, Rosalie Lewis.
And I'm your other co-host, Tim Rosenberger.
And today we're going to be talking about two movies, both directed by the wonderful Pedro Almodóvar. So we'll be speaking today about Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown, which came out in 1987. And we'll also be talking about Volver, which came out in 2006. So these are two movies that have some connecting tissue besides just their director, and we'll get into that. But before we dive in too much further, these were my picks, Tim, so I'd love to hear from you. First of all, had you seen any Pedro Almodóvar films before? And if not, did you have any kind of preconceived notions going into watching these?
I had not seen any of his films prior to this one. I had certainly heard of some of them. I had heard of Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown. I had heard, and I think seen the Siskel and Ebert review of The Skin I Live In, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I think that one. And then obviously I had heard of one of his recent films, the one he had done recently-ish with Antonio Banderas, that Antonio Banderas got nominated for an Oscar for. So, I was aware of him, but I had never actually seen any of his movies, so it was nice to dive into this. I didn't really have much of any preconceived notions of him. I knew very little about his films. I know at least The Skin I Live In seemed a bit odd, but I didn't really know about the rest of his films. But I figured they were dramas, and that was about it. So I went into his work and into both these movies pretty clueless.
Well, I think that's a good way to go, because I do feel like Almodóvar is a director that, you probably have heard the name if you're a film fan, but a lot of his movies end up getting nominated for Academy Awards in the foreign film category, right? Or, maybe occasionally there will be a Best Actress nomination. But I'm really happy to be talking about him because he's been making movies quite consistently since the 80s. And he's responsible for the career of Antonio Banderas, among other people. And I really do mean that. Like, they got their start together, they made several movies together, and then, of course, he reteamed with him recently for Pain and Glory, which is kind of a semi-autobiographical movie that Almodóvar made, and, Banderas kind of played that version of him. But he's a really interesting guy. For those that don't know too much about him, he's from Spain, and he's sort of started his career kind of doing his own thing. He was sort of an independent filmmaker. He had his own production company, and they made some films, he and his kind of friends and people that he was hanging around with at the time. They made very kind of like artsy films that were a bit subversive, definitely a little irreverent, and often taking on, sexual topics or dark comedy or, things that maybe were a little bit more taboo in society, both at the time and perhaps now. And as his career goes on, you do see that thread kind of continuing to go through. But one thing I think he does especially well is give great roles to women and really film movies that women are at the center of really well.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll talk a little bit more about that with both of these movies. But I think that's good kind of context to have about Almodóvar, who himself, has been, featured in the news and has commented on various things. He's often interviewed, even just, showing up at film festivals and things like that. So he's an interesting figure, even outside of his own work. But I'm excited to dive in.
Why did you, obviously he's done quite a few films by this point. Why did you pick these two in particular?
Yeah, so the first movie of his that I saw was Volver.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe it was one of those things where I was trying to be completist about the Oscar-nominated films, and that was one that was nominated, and I was like, okay, well, I'll watch it. Like, I'm not afraid of subtitles. And then I remember really liking it and being kind of intrigued because it was so different from other things I'd seen. And then, over time, kind of dug into some of his other filmography. So I think I've seen about half of his filmography. He's done some stuff that's a little harder to track down, especially in the U.S. But I have an Almodóvar box set of DVDs that includes like Tie Me Up, Tie Me Down, All About My Mother. I've seen, his most recent film, Parallel Mothers, which I thought was fantastic. I love The Skin I Live In, which definitely is a weird one, but a good one. And I also really like Talk to Her. So I've seen a fair number of his movies, but these two in particular, I feel like Volver being the first one I'd ever seen of his, I had to talk about that. And then I think Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown, well, since you've seen my Letterboxd, Tim, that it's one of the ones that's in my top, favorites list of all time. And it's a movie that from the first second that I saw it, I was like, this is a movie that was made for me.
Mhm.
So they're kind of on different ends of the spectrum from an emotional or mood standpoint, but I do think there's some stuff that will be fun to talk about. And one thing is that they do have an actress in common. So we can talk about that a little bit more as we get to it. And, I would say one of the reasons I picked these two movies is I would say they're pretty approachable. Some of his films are a little bit more experimental, or at least the premise might alienate some people. I do think once you get into them, you would like them. But, I think these are a little bit more easy to get into. And so if you're just getting introduced to Almodóvar's work, I think these are two good ones to start with. And if you like these, there's a lot of other places that you can go from here. I will say just overall, I think he's a very humanist filmmaker. So even his dark comedies that are, taking on some fairly absurd material at times, I still think at the heart of them, there's this really emotional core that is universal, even when he's taking on more transgressive themes. So hopefully, that came through for you in these movies, at least to some extent. And if you liked these, definitely hope that you'll check out some more. So I'll find out more as we talk about them.
Soy infeliz porque sé que no me quieres, para qué más insistir. Vive feliz, mi bien, si el amor que tú me diste para siempre de sentir.
So let's go ahead and start with Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown. So this one, as I mentioned, came out in 1988 in Spain. And this one he had Antonio Banderas, who was very young at the time, but he had collaborated with him a few times. And he also had Carmen Mora, who is the actress that will appear again in Volver. And Julieta Serrano is in this one as well. And a number of other just really great cast members that, I can't say they're well-known names here in the US, for example, but I do think that they had such distinctive faces and mannerisms, and I don't know to what extent they're stars in Spain, but I would think so. So Rossi de Palma would be another one, Guillermo Montesinos, and Maria Barranco. So lots of great people, and this is one of those movies that actually has been made into a musical.
Mm-hmm.
And I can see why that would work well, because it does take place in a few different settings, but primarily it's people talking in one or a couple of different rooms, right? So a very talky movie. And I realized as I was doing a little research for it that it's actually based on a play from 1930 by Jean Cocteau. So I guess that makes sense that it's kind of come full circle. So the basic story here is a woman named Peppa, who's played by Carmen Mora, is coming home and she seems like she's very distraught. And we find out that basically the man she's been seeing is leaving her for another woman, or has left her for another woman. And as the story unfolds, we realize, well, Peppa was sort of the other woman for a while, right? Because her lover was married, but his wife was in a mental hospital and had some other issues going on. And so she's just feeling devastated and kind of overwhelmed. And she's trying to reach him on the phone. before he leaves the country, because he's told her he's going to be leaving on a trip and she's not going to be going with him. So that's kind of how it starts, but it definitely escalates from there. The tone of this movie is one of, I mean, you might be able to guess based on the name, right? Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown. It definitely hits some little hysterical high points. It's definitely a movie with a sense of humor, and it's very much an ensemble kind of comedy, but it plays on some very melodramatic notes as well. For example, she sets fire to their bed. So it's just one thing that happens in a series of kind of escalating things. But I won't go further than that before I ask you, Tim. What were your thoughts on this movie?
So, I mean, after finishing the movie, I think I understood what he was going for with I'm assuming I haven't read in terms of what his interpretation of this was, what he was going for, but I'm assuming in the kind of direction and screenplay of it, it seemed like he was almost going for an almost kind of over the top screwball comedy type thing in a way,
Yeah.
where somebody's trying to, like, one of those screwball comedies where somebody's trying to accomplish something that's relatively simple, where in this one she's trying to tell her lover, now old lover, a sentence that is simple but that contains very important information for him. And she's just trying to tell him this throughout the movie, and she can't find him or get a hold of him. But while she's trying to do that, all these insane, crazy things are happening around her, and she has to deal with those before she can continue dealing with the problem that she's dealing with. And things are just kind of weird and crazy, and you have eccentric characters, and she's running around everywhere and all that stuff. I'm assuming that's what he was going for. I think that is a fine idea for this, and a fine genre or vehicle to partially talk about women and the way men can treat them. However, I felt it didn't. And I feel really bad saying this because I know you really love the movie. It didn't quite work for me. Again, I admire what it was trying to do with it, but I guess it wasn't quite. The humor didn't land quite as much for me, and the whole kind of zany, well, slightly understated zany. I don't want to overstate that, but kind of understated zaniness of it wasn't quite enough for me. And the stuff that would fit very well in a screwball comedy type thing, it came off more just kind of weird for the most part. Like, there's a lot of stuff that just feels kind of odd, or just odd plot developments and stuff. I think ultimately the odd plot developments kind of work for it, but it's just, I don't know, it just had kind of an odd feel to it that didn't quite work for me. But
Oh,
yeah, I don't hate the movie. I don't want to act like I hated it. I didn't hate it. It just was kind of like, I wish I had liked it more. I will say this. There were things that worked for me in the movie, and one thing that worked for me in the movie was the movie. One of the things it begins with very early on is a black and white sequence with Peppa's lover, where he's basically with a microphone walking down the street and basically telling these sweet nothings to random women in this kind of fantasy sequence. And that's really funny just because it's really over the top and just ridiculous, because he's saying things like something akin to "I'll always love you" or "I'll always remember the night we had together," and just things like that that are just really kind of generic and just kind of ridiculous, but things but put you in the sense of what his character is, which is this kind of very manipulative, kind of womanizing jerk, essentially. But it tells us about his character, but also I thought was very funny. So there are things like that worked for me.
well, I'm glad it wasn't a total loss. I am sad that you didn't fall for it the same way I did, but I completely understand. It's definitely a unique approach to the material. But I guess I'll start by talking about what I do love about it, and maybe I can convince you, and if not, then that's okay. We'll hope for better things for the next one. But, from the very beginning, one of the things that always stands out to me about this movie is the use of color. And
Hmm.
that's something that I feel like Almodóvar does very well in a lot of his films. But, you have a lot of bright blues and pinks and reds, and it comes through in the clothing, it comes through in the set design, it comes through in even the way that he shoots very basic things like appliances or clocks, or the inside of a taxi cab in
Hmm.
this case. So very unique and very bright colors that I think add to just this feeling of life that is really pulsating through the movie. There's nothing drab at all about it. And it's interesting, the sequence you mentioned where you see Ivan giving his regards to all these different women, and it is in black and white. And there's a few sequences in the movie that cut to black and white, in part because that's Peppa and Ivan's job. They are both actors, and they dub foreign films. So one of the foreign films that they dub is Johnny Guitar. So you see like Joan Crawford and Sterling Hayden talking to each other, but then you hear the voices of Peppa and Ivan. So I like those little touches where it's like it's mixing fantasy and real life in a very interesting way. And the fact that she is an actress in this movie, you have to wonder, like, is she reacting to situations in her life in a real way or in like the fantasy way that she wishes her life would play out,
Well,
right? So I like that kind of hyper realistic.
well, yeah, and I think also their jobs as kind of dubbers, among other things. I think they do not actual, they do non-dubbing work as well. I think it's implied, but
Yes.
I think one of the benefits of that, of them dubbing that, especially dubbing that movie, which I'm not terribly familiar with, but the scene that they are dubbing, that they showed them dubbing in the movie, is this kind of romantic-ish scene where one of them characters is saying goodbye to the other and stuff, and there's obviously a romance that's ending or whatever. And what I liked about that is it kind of again fits with what Ivan's character is like in terms
Mm-hmm.
of, I mean, he is putting on an act for all these women, but then also he's this kind of very over the top guy who might have gotten a lot of his lines and moves from these romantic Hollywood or other foreign, other non-Spanish films, and he plays it very much like that. This kind of over the top lover dude, but without any of the heart and stuff. So I think that kind of fits in with the kind of headspace that he is putting women in, and that Peppa is particularly in, just coming out of the affair with him.
The other thing that I really enjoy is all the coincidences, right? And you talked about this being a screwball comedy, which even for me, those can be hit and miss. I feel like, especially modern ones, have a really fine balancing act because if they go too far into it, it just comes across as silly. But they have to kind of play it straight while being over the top. And I think this one somehow manages to do that. So even though, for example, like I mentioned, she lights the bed on fire and she's throwing things out the window, which breaks the glass, and she rips the phone out of the wall, and she throws a record out the window and it, hits a person in the head, and all these things. And gazpacho is used not once but multiple times as a way to get rid of people or make them
Incapacitated.
otherwise not be a problem anymore, let's say. So there's a lot of like crazy things that are happening, but it's grounded in real problems that people have. Like real people do go through breakups and do experience like love triangles and do feel this kind of sense of isolation or being screwed over or trying to help their friends, and their friends think their problem is like the worst problem in the world, and it's like, okay, why am I always the one helping you and not the other way around, right? So I feel like in the midst of all this calamity, there's a realness to it that grounds it in a way, and that's what makes it work for me.
You mentioned earlier about the kind of look of his films. I would say for this one, I certainly noticed the color of his films, but also I noticed his way of framing and I guess lighting and coloring. What are at the surface really kind of simple shots,
Mm-hmm.
but he makes those simple shots stand out. Like there's one point in the movie where Peppa is talking on the phone to Ivan's wife, and there's just the camera is just kind of looking straight at them, and I think the actresses are looking straight at the camera essentially, and it cuts between the two of them, and just that, which is again is a very simple shot, but he makes it stand out really well, and it comes off almost like to give people an idea. It almost feels to me. I'm not saying their styles are similar, but it almost kind of imagine how somebody like a Wes Anderson makes simple in concept shots really stand out and kind of look really beautiful and almost painterly in certain ways and stuff. He does with certain shots in this film. So yeah, he makes simple things really kind of pretty and just kind of like I just remember that shot. I will remember those two shots probably the most of any in the movie just because they're so just interesting. I don't even know exactly what he's doing, but he really excels in that sort of thing.
Yeah, there's a couple shots that really stand out for me in this too. One of them, going back to the answering machine, is she's taken the tape out, the little cassette tape out, and she's looking through it, and the camera is positioned on the other side of the tape. So we're looking through the two little, holes of the cassette tape as if it's almost like glasses that she's wearing. That's the only way I can describe it, because it lines up with her face. And I just thought that was such a unique shot to pull. And then the other one that I really love is towards the end of the film, and it's a woman riding a motorcycle, and her hair is blowing back, and she has these ridiculous drawn on eyelashes, and she just looks, I don't even know how to describe it, but I love it, and I wish that I had a mural of it on my wall. Like, that is just one of my favorite shots, because it's something that you would never have any idea what this movie is about if you just saw that isolated, but you might be like, I kind of want to see what this is. So yeah, I love the framing, and I love the angles that he uses. It's completely unexpected.
Beyond the look of his films, I think for this and for Volver, I feel like the music he picked, the instrumental non-diegetic stuff for this and Volver, I felt was, it almost came off as more something you would have heard in kind of a 40s or 50s Hollywood film or something. It just felt not of its era, but I think in a good way. It gave it a very specific feel to it, to both of the movies when that music played. So I found that choice interesting. I don't know if he does that in other films that he does, but it did stand out, I think, as an interesting choice to make for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that music is a kind of key to understanding what he's going for with this movie, because I do feel like it's a throwback to, the 1930s, 40s screwball type of comedies. So it makes sense to put that in there the same way it makes sense that he would use, a Nicholas Ray film, Johnny Guitar, in this movie, because I think he definitely admires movies from that era, and he's kind of doing a little bit of a nod to those. Something interesting that I learned, because I love these actors. I think this ensemble is just dynamite together. But one thing that I was surprised to learn reading about it is that actually Carmen Mora, I don't know the exact origins of it, but Carmen Mora, the lead actress, was fighting with Pedro Almodóvar during the movie, and for a while she stopped talking to him altogether. So I don't know how that would work when she's the lead of his movie and he's directing her, but it seems like they've moved on from it, because she did come back around and she was in Volver, but definitely an interesting little background. But I think she is really great in anchoring this film. Like, you just see her world weariness, I feel like, in every frame. It's that look in those eyes, but also the determination that she doesn't want to let him win, right? Like, she's desperate to talk to him, but she's not gonna like let her life be just over because he's moving on. So I liked that, and I think that's the case in the next movie, which we'll talk about as well. Is just that kind of sense of like, yes, I'm tired, like I'm exhausted by how I've been treated, but also there's more to life than this man that has mistreated me.
Yeah, and I think, but there's still, I think, an element of her that hasn't quite gotten over him in the movie, and I think the movie is
Mm-hmm.
partially a journey of her fully just moving on from him and the way he's treated her and stuff.
I also have to talk about Antonio Banderas,
Mm.
because I love him in this movie, playing just kind of this like young, naive guy. So his role, we should say, he originally comes to see the apartment that Peppa is saying she's going to sublet. And so he and his fiance, played by Rossi De Palma, are coming to look at the apartment. But it also just so happens that he is Ivan's son. And so Peppa knows who he is, even though she's never met him. And he recognizes his dad's picture in the bedroom and is like, oh, wait, now I know who you are. So they have an interesting conversation, obviously, kind of explaining what all has gone on. And, he talks about his mother, and she kind of forms like a tender attachment to him and kind of sees him almost as, it seems like, her own surrogate son, which is interesting. But I just loved their dynamic, and I loved Antonio Banderas as this very young person who is fanatical about kissing, according to another character in the movie.
Yeah, he is almost. I think at one point when his mother finds out that what he's been kind of doing, or so, when some character finds out what that he's not necessarily maybe as faithful to his fiance who he's seeing the apartment with, they basically say, oh, he's just like his father.
Yeah.
So he does have an element of that kind of womanizing, not quite faithful thing. And hopefully he does seem better than his father, so there's maybe some hope that he won't turn out as bad as him. But yeah, it is interesting because Antonio Banderas was like, I don't know, like 25 or 26 or something when he did this. So he was very young, and it's interesting because we think of Antonio Banderas. I think most of us will think the first image we'll think of him as this kind of very suave, romantic guy and stuff. And in this, he doesn't really have that. He's like you said, he's very young, and he's more of, like you said, naive, but also he's not really great at with women. He's not suave. He's not really romantic at all. He's just kind of, he's still handsome, but he's kind of just falls on his feet when it comes to relationships, it seems like. And kind of, it looks like he's the type of person who could maybe has the habit of sticking his foot in his mouth and stuff. So that was a nice, interesting thing to see as a kind of a counterpoint to what we normally think of Antonio Banderas as.
I really enjoyed, like seeing him as the not very hip, like he has I know it was probably the style at the time, but like
He has a big
not very
jacket.
hip looking glasses. His outfit is very
It's very baggy, but I think there's a lot
yeah.
of baggy 80s clothes from what I've seen.
I know it was probably the look, but like seeing him, I was like, oh, like he dresses so much better now. You know what I mean? Like, and again, like you said, he's still good looking because it's Antonio Banderas, but he definitely improved his style with age, or at least his characters did. But yeah, it's fun to see him at this stage of life, and clearly he's having a good time, and it was fun to see Carmen Mora kind of take him under her wing and kind of knowingly look at him and be like, all right, you're going to be fine. You'll bounce back, but she also knows exactly what's going to happen even before it happens.
Yeah.
When it comes to him. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I enjoyed that very much.
What do you think this says about? I mean, obviously, this is saying something, at least a little bit about. I think I mentioned it earlier, but how men can treat women very poorly, and how men can be giant, whats and stuff.
Sure.
And stuff. How do we think it approaches that? I don't think it goes terribly deep into that sort of stuff. In some cases, I think it goes maybe a little bit more shallow than I would want, or at least if I don't know, I don't think movies with messages always have to be terribly deep, but if they're at least not going like really diving into it with whatever, they at least want a fresher perspective. And I don't think for me there wasn't as enough of a fresh perspective on that angle of it for me to really kind of dig into. But what did you feel about that kind of part of the movie?
So I think, just by its nature of it being a fairly lighthearted farce, I don't know that it was ever going to be super messagey. That being said, I think that theme of like women's independence and, particularly the character of Peppa, but also just the way that the women seem to sort of be banding together towards the end,
Mm-hmm.
is a really nice message if you're going to have a takeaway from this. I
Mm-hmm.
like the fact that, again, they find common ground. And one of the things that I find interesting is that there's a character that they refer to as a feminist who turns out to perhaps not be on the side of other women as much as they would hope. And that they, even if they don't identify themselves as feminists, are really doing more to kind of advance the cause of caring about other women and treating other people as humans. So I thought that was an interesting little contrast and perhaps a bit of commentary.
Yeah, it is a very pro women movie, but it's also showing it is not doing this kind of fantasy thing where all women are perfect, all guys are
Right.
jerks and stuff, which I think was a good idea, because otherwise it just, especially if you want to win people over in certain views, it's not really going to help with that if it's that kind of black and white thing.
Right. Yeah, I feel like it portrays kind of a wide spectrum of, how gender relationships can be, and I appreciated that. There's no perfect characters in this movie other than maybe that taxi driver who I just love.
Yeah,
They all have their flaws other than him.
yeah, and this very understanding taxi driver who Peppa keeps just happens to be getting his cab every time she needs to go somewhere, And he's this very over-the-top, bleached blonde guy who's just, who's this nice little guy. He doesn't really steal the show, but he's a nice to see when he pops up. He's almost since does seem to be the most stable of all the characters in the movie, he's almost kind of a nice little break from the kind of the dysfunction around you, so you can kind of just calm down when his scenes are there, because you have somebody who's a bit more supportive and not as messed up. So it's nice. His scenes are nice. They're not, I don't think, great, but they're nice to have in the movie.
Well, his cab is designed to be kind of a lounge, so it's a little bit of an oasis from the outside world, and I enjoyed that.
Exactly, yeah.
Esta mañana muy tempranito salí del pueblo con el látigo y como entonces la aurora venía yo la recibía cantando como un pajarito.
We can move on to our second film, Volver, which came out in 2006. This one, again, directed and written by Pedro Almodóvar. It stars Penelope Cruz as Ramunda, who is married to a guy named Paco. They have a daughter, Paula, and Paco has recently gotten fired from whatever job he had. Well, in the meantime, Ramunda is just kind of running around doing all the jobs she can to help support them. They aren't terribly financially stable. And one of the things that she does, I guess, I don't know if she actually gets paid for it, but Ramunda and her sister Sol, they, I guess, help maintain and clean graves in the town or village in Spain that they're in. And they visit and check in on their Aunt Paula from time to time. Their Aunt Paula is pretty old. Her mind is kind of mostly gone by this point. She might have some sort of, it's not really explained, but she might have some form of Alzheimer's or dementia or something. Basically, she's very much living in the past and stuff, and she talks about very much about, she doesn't really recognize Sol. She recognizes Ramunda, but not Sol. Doesn't recognize Paula. Is very much talks a lot about how Ramunda and Sol's mother, talks about how she's still around, even though she is said to have died in a fire with Ramunda and Sol's father. But things get kind of kicked off rather intensely when Ramunda comes home one day and Paula is very upset. And we find out that it's because she has, well, not certainly not premeditated, and certainly not very intentionally. She has, in self-defense, has killed her father Paco when Paco tried to rape her. So Ramunda and Paula hide the body in the freezer of a restaurant that Ramunda is looking after while the owner is away. And in the meantime, they're also helping to feed a film crew that is staying in town, and they're making money that way. And meanwhile, Augustina is starting to not do so terribly well, and she's wondering what is going on, where her mother, who disappeared 3-4 years ago, where she went, because they never knew where she went, and she's never disappeared for this long, because that was a habit with her, that she would disappear for long periods of time. And Sol has, after visiting their Aunt Paula, unfortunately passes away, and Sol has to go to her wake by herself, as Ramunda is busy hiding the body, unbeknownst to Sol. And Sol goes to the party and strangely meets up with her mother, who she calls, who think she and the villagers around said they've seen glimpses of her mother and think of her as being a ghost. So her mother comes to room with her, and Sol cleans her up, dyes her hair darker again, cuts her hair and stuff, and her mother, who is not recognized in the village that they're now living in, pretends to be a Russian hairdress assistant to Sol. All the while, Ramunda is running around trying to accomplish his stuff and dispose of the body, and still make money and kind of rebuild her life and all this stuff. So a lot going on in this movie, I think, and a lot of characters to kind of keep track of and stuff like that. You will probably be happy to know I did like this movie much more.
Oh, thank goodness.
And the thing that's interesting about this is, and I think, at least based off of this and Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown, obviously I haven't seen the rest of his films, so I don't know if this is true for those other ones as well, his early ones and his more recent ones. But his movies, Pedro Almodóvar's movies, they seem very much like they establish one thing and you think you kind of know what the movie's going to be about, and then it figures out, oh no, it's not really about that at all. Because the whole Paco thing. That's almost, in any other movie, that would be the main thing. It would almost be kind of this very intense drama, thriller, edge of your seat thing. But it's really, oddly enough, it's almost really a subplot of the movie, which I found really kind of interesting. Yeah, you think it's going to be about that. Then it's like, no, it's really just kind of this relationship drama about kind of this mother who was imperfect and her kids, particularly Ramunda, who was imperfect, and their relationships and maybe past familiar parental childhood trauma stuff that needs to be healed and stuff. This film is very appropriate for now because you're seeing stuff like that again in movies like Everywhere, Everything, All at Once and Turning Red and stuff, where you're seeing these kind of parents trying to maybe heal relationships with their kids and vice versa that have kind of formed and stuff. So yeah, it's interesting movie. It has kind of a supernatural tinge to it, along with kind of a mystery aspects to it, a lot of twists and turns and stuff, but also a lot of just touching, personal, relatable stuff as well. So I think it was a very interesting movie and a unique way to go about it that seems, I don't know, it seems like Spanish people, like whether people from Spain or people from Mexico, seem to have this kind of tinge of using supernatural stuff in very unique ways. Like they'll have, like we a movie we talked about forever ago, Spirit of the Beehive, where it's using these kind of supernatural elements to talk about very just kind of everyday relationship things. It just seems like, again, people from Spain or people from Mexico have this really unique way of using supernatural elements that really stand out to tell very everyday things, which I really gravitate towards and just seem very interesting and in some ways literary.
Yeah, literary is a great way to describe that. This movie, this time watching it today, I feel like I just finished reading a really good novel. It has that feeling and that scope to it, and it's tackling bigger themes. Like, I think we can definitely say this movie, more so than Women on the Verge, is about something. It's not just a fun film to watch, but it's about life and death in very real terms, and it's about those family relationships, and it's about intergenerational trauma, and it's about the violence of men against women, and it's about women banding together. It's got a lot on its mind, and that would sound, if you hadn't seen it, it might sound like, ugh, that sounds like a chore to watch. It's really not. This movie moves along at a very good pace. I was never bored watching it. I remember the first time seeing it, I was like, I don't know what they're going to do next. Because to your point, right, the death of Paco was like, okay, this is what we're doing. The rest of the movie is going to be about them covering up this death and, having to evade the police or whatever. That's really in the foreground of everything else that happens. And then you get the character of the mother, played by our recurring friend from Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown. And of course, she's aged quite a bit, but her character, at the beginning, we're not sure, is she a ghost? Is she real? Are they imagining this because of their grief? Or, is she appearing to them because they need her? Or is there something else going on in the story? So it takes a while to really get your feet under you. But in the meantime, there's so much going on. There's so much life to be lived in this movie, right? So, she has this restaurant that she has the keys because she's supposed to be showing it to potential renters because she's taking care of it. But then, she ends up taking over the restaurant herself in a little twist. And that whole bit is fun to watch, even though it doesn't necessarily move a plot forward. It's just about seeing her really embrace life and be resilient in the face of this incredible thing that has happened. So yeah, I just love the spirit of really like life that is in this movie that is also talking about death. It's a really interesting contrast.
Again, it's kind of almost covert mystery thing where it's kind of a mystery, but you don't really realize the movie's partially a mystery for a lot of it. And despite it's very heavy subject matter in certain places, again, dealing with rape and sexual assaults and trauma and stuff, which is very intense and is dealt with very frankly. But despite that heavier stuff in it, it really is kind of just a very sweet movie, again about sisters, about a mother and daughter with Ramunda and Paula, between Ramunda and her mother Irene and Soul and stuff. And I mean, Penelope Cruz has a winning smile anyway, but there's just and she has a life to her anyway, but there's this healing going on with her that really I think kind of can just give the audience a bit more life too, in terms of you feel like you almost feel a bit more as revitalized as maybe she's getting throughout the film, and you feel a bit more healed as she's maybe getting a bit more healed and getting her emotions out, and maybe you walk out of the movie feeling a bit more love for life as well. So yeah, I think ultimately it's a very positive movie, and it's a movie about, in a way, there are elements of Paula. They don't deal with this a lot, but especially near the end of the film, there's a moment of her kind of, when she finds out how the body was disposed, she basically says something along the lines of, well, I'm glad he's at peace there. So there's this element of, even though he has done this, or attempted to do this really horrible thing to her, there's this element of forgiveness, or at least as much of forgiveness as you can have for somebody who tried to do something like that. So again, Paula is also, in her own way, even though the movie doesn't focus on her as much as the other characters, there's her own healing going on, which, I haven't thankfully been through something that she's been through, but I'm sure when people can find their own ways to heal in as much as they can from things as horrible as that, I'm sure it's very helpful. So it was good, and maybe in some ways cathartic to see Paula's kind of journey throughout the film.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, not something that we always see in movies that have that kind of violence at the start of them, but we really see that resilience, that healing. We see her spending time with different female relatives who are nurturing her and helping her along. And while we see at the beginning this character who's young, I mean, she's probably, dealing with the trials of being a teenager. She even says in response to someone at one point, I'm at a very difficult age, which I love. But we kind of see her blossom as the film goes on and really kind of take on more joy, it seems. Like she's more genuinely present in the moment and connecting with the people around her in a way that she wasn't at the beginning of the movie. So, and that's of course not to say that her trauma is helping her. It's obviously not, but the fact that she has worked through what she's going through with these people around her, I think ties to the importance of family and community in healing from any kind of trauma. I want to talk for a second about the look of Penelope Cruz in this movie, because if you've seen Penelope Cruz in other films, you obviously know that she's gorgeous and that she has a very striking face and everything. But in this movie in particular, her hair and the style that she has is actually reminds me a lot more of like 1960s Italian like films. I think about, Sophia Loren, and she has kind of a Sophia Loren hairstyle in this, of those kinds of movies, and that's actually not accidental. So in reading about it, it turns out that Almodóvar is also a fan of those movies, and he based the look that Penelope has here on kind of the Italian housewife of the 1950s and 60s. So he mentioned specifically Sophia Loren, Anna Magnani, Claudia Cardinal. And so she does have kind of this like updo, and even though she dresses fairly, simply because she's cooking or she's cleaning, and she's not necessarily a woman of great means at all, she still has that kind of classical beauty to her, which I really liked. And I think she embodies that very well. Like, it's an unself-conscious look, but clearly somebody who's like careful about her appearance and careful about, kind of appearing a certain way, which I think adds to her character.
In a way, I mean, we talked about feminism a little bit in the end of the Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown section, but she's kind of a feminist in just what she does. She doesn't have to say she's a feminist. She is just that. She's very hardworking. She's very strong. She is very confident in herself in terms of her skills and her knowledge. She's very confident in your body. Not necessarily to say that you have to be confident in all those things to be a strong woman or whatever, but there's a simple kind of elegance and beauty about her where she is beautiful, but she doesn't seem like she has to try very hard to do it.
Yeah.
I mean, I know. True. I mean, yes, women have to use a lot of makeup. They have to do a lot of stuff with their hair. They have to do whatever, all this stuff. But she's at least in this movie, she's one of those people who makes something probably that is probably much harder than it looks look very easy, and is not afraid to show off her body either, but still does it with a sense of class. She's not doing it in a very tasteless way. It's very tasteful to what she's doing. And I remember something I read briefly was, I didn't give a lot of context for this, but I'm sure it must have had to do with what you were talking about with the look that Almodóvar was trying to go with her character. He said that basically everything you see of her body in the movie is real except for her butt, which he said that I think he had to pad or something because it wasn't. I think he said that she was too stylized or something, her body, so he had to.
Yeah, they had to make her look more like an actual housewife.
At the same time, she does. I don't know. Her beauty does bring a beauty to the film as well, and yeah, she's just. I think if you were to make this like, just with the way she looks and the way she acts, even without dialogue, if you were to make this into a silent film, you could get all the same stuff from her performance because she's just very expressive, and you can get so much richness just from her expressions, from whether she's crying or upset or scared or just happy or healing or whatever. You can just get all that within her face. You almost don't even need the lines. So she's brilliant in the acting sense as well.
The other actress that I have to call out that we haven't mentioned is Lole Duenas. I'm sure I'm probably butchering the name, but she plays Sol, the sister, and she has such and I'm saying this not to make her sound like she's unattractive. She just has a very unique face. Like, she doesn't necessarily look like you might see in a Hollywood film. She has a face that has character, and she is beautiful as well. But I love her facial expressions in contrast to Penelope Cruz, because you can tell that they're siblings in this movie, but they also definitely, just have like a different approach to life and, kind of look a little bit different. And some of her facial expressions, like, she conveys surprise very well, whereas I feel like Penelope Cruz, her character is good at having a poker face a little bit in certain situations. So it's fun to see that contrast of these sisters on film, of one that's like needs to keep a secret but is very bad at doing so, and the other one that also needs to keep a secret and is, I would say, much more successful.
Yeah.
Really what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, Soul seems much more. Ramunda seems much more of like a pessimistic and practical person, and you can understand why as you go through the film. Not just the stuff with Paco, but other things too. But Soul seems, and you even get a bit of this in some dialogue. When Soul takes her mother in, pretends that she's a kind of a Russian street person who she took in out of the goodness of her heart. Some of the people she's cutting hair for, talk about how, you shouldn't take people in that you don't know, and she's gonna take advantage of you and stuff like that. You're too trusting and stuff. And Soul, you do get the impression that Soul is more childlike in a way, maybe a bit more naive, more optimistic, more likely to believe in fantastical things and stuff, which is, she seems to be less. Yeah, Ramunda is very much like, okay, we have to get this stuff done because we have to pay bills, we have to do this, I have to work, I have to do this. Soul seems much more carefree. She's working, she's supporting herself, but she doesn't seem as bothered by that stuff, and maybe that's why it's a bit more easier for her to enjoy certain aspects of life. But she's also unmarried. Well, I think she says she had a husband, but he's not in the picture anymore. But she doesn't have a child, so that makes things easier, obviously. But yeah, it is a kind of nice counterbalance to that sort of stuff. But also the actress, I don't really know anything about her. I don't know if I've seen her in anything else before. But going back to what you said about her facial expressions, I don't know if she's done like a lot of like straight out just comedies. There are funny stuff in this, but it's more of a drama with some comedy in it, this one. But if she's done just more straight out comedies and stuff, but I feel like she'd be really good for that because she just has like you said, her facial expressions just seem very much like they'd be great for just like a silly comedy.
I do want to talk about the music in this movie, which the composer Alberto Iglesias, who thankfully has now at least been nominated for an Oscar, I don't know if he's won, but he does the score, which I absolutely love. But music plays a really important role in this too. In fact, the title of the movie, Volver, comes from a song that is sung by Penelope Cruz's character in this movie, a song called Volver, where, she's really like re-embracing her talent of singing that she hasn't done since she was a child. And she remembers like her mom entered her into this singing contest and taught her this song. And now she's kind of reliving that joyful moment as she is, kind of hanging out with this film crew that has, been enjoying her restaurant, and they're having their little wrap party there. And she just, decides that she's going to sing this song. And I have to say that moment just moves me to tears. Like, I know it's not really her singing it, but the power of the song and the faraway look she gets in her eyes, and then, correspondingly, her mother happens to be near enough to hear the song and have a reaction as well. And it's a really beautiful moment.
Yeah, it is a very touching scene and song. It is very much part of her healing process of her getting out these emotions she's probably repressed a lot, and she's crying a bit throughout the song, and it feels very much like a very healthy scream.
Yeah.
Where she's just getting this out finally, and once it's out, she can do a better job of healing the wounds and trauma and sadness and loss in her life. So yeah, it's very touching.
Yeah, and the thing that really inspires her to sing actually is she hears the guitars going, because a couple of people are, sitting on the patio and playing the guitars, and then she starts humming along, and her daughter, Paula, is like, "Oh, I've never heard you sing." She's like, "Of course you have." And she's like, "No, Mom, like, you never sing." And that's what kind of sparks it in her to be like, my daughter has never seen this side of me that used to be so important. So in some ways, it's also, I feel like she's singing it for herself and for her daughter, Paula, and for her mom. So it's like the thing that unites those three generations. So, Tim, now that you have seen two Pedro Almodóvar films, granted separated by a couple of decades, are you curious to see more? Do you think you'll seek out any other films by him?
No, not at all. He's just worst filmmaker I've ever seen. No,
How dare you?
no, I will. I will say I've been interested in. I mean, Parallel Mothers. Obviously, I heard great things about. I don't know when or if I'll necessarily see that one or not. I don't think I'm emotionally ready to watch that one right now. But certainly, Pain and Glory. Just from the acclaim that Antonio Banderas got for that, and the fact that I love Antonio Banderas and pretty much anything he's in. I've certainly watched that at some point. Some of his other stuff, like whatever. I'm sorry, Pedro Almodóvar fans. I don't remember the name of the movie, but the Tie Me Up, Tie Me Down.
Tie Me Up, Tie Me Down.
Tie Me Up, Tie Me Down movie. That one is probably more. I don't know. I've seen people talk about it. I don't think that's necessarily my thing, or maybe that other the whatever that was, that Skin movie or whatever. That seems a bit too weird for me. I might give them a shot at some point, but yeah, some of the odder things he's done I might steer away from. But yeah, I certainly will watch other stuff that he's done. He certainly is. He is a unique filmmaker who tells stories in unique but familiar and identifiable ways. So I will certainly check out more of his stuff at some point. Probably not all the time, and probably not anytime soon, just because his movies, at least based off these two, can be a lot emotionally. So I wouldn't necessarily want to do them all the time, but I would definitely check out more of his stuff.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. So I will recommend, for people who watch these two movies and are wondering what should I watch next by him, I think a good next step would be All About My Mother. I would say that's probably my third favorite of his, of the ones that I have seen. And that one came out in 1999, so it's also a good one because it's sort of in between these two. And it has, a lot of the elements that I like about both of these movies, and once again kind of centers the story around women and their experiences. So All About My Mother is a great next step if you liked one or both of these. And then, like you mentioned, Pain and Glory is a fantastic semi-autobiographical story that I think is definitely well worth tracking down. Even if you've never seen an Almodóvar movie and you heard our podcast and for some reason, haven't seen these movies, and you're wondering if you should watch something else before you get to Pain and Glory. I think it would add shades of color if you had seen other movies of his, but you certainly don't have to. Pain and Glory is a great movie on its own, and Parallel Mothers definitely has some emotion in it that is a little heavy at times, but I found it to be quite hopeful as well. So when you do feel up to it, I definitely recommend that one too.
But why don't we transition into talking about some stuff that is coming up? There's a few things I'm interested in that I came across. One is, and I'm sure I'm mispronouncing this, but I think it's a French movie called Gagarine. It's Gagarine. It's a Blu-ray release. It's a film. It did come out this year. It's a 2022 film. And the summary for it was Yuri, who is 16, has lived all of his life in Gangrene Towers, a vast red brick housing project on the outskirts of Paris. From the heights of his apartment, he dreams of becoming an astronaut, but when plans to demolish his community's home are leaked, Yuri joins the resistance. With his friends Diana and somebody else whose name I can't pronounce, he embarks on a mission to save Gangrene, transforming the estate into his own starship. So that seemed very interesting to me. I will probably check that out at some point, and I'm sure my wife will be happy that I'm checking out more movies from this century, as she likes to put it. And there's also a movie from 1983 that they're releasing as a 3D special edition Blu-ray called Treasure of the Four Crowns. I don't really know much about this at all, except that its cover looks awesome. I'm assuming that's from an old poster, and it just looks really cool and old-fashioned, and I might check that out just for some old-fashioned 80s fun. And then the last one I want to highlight is, it looks like an interesting box set, a collection for Miklos Jankso, Jancso. I'm sure I'm butchering that name, but looks like films from Hungary. And just to read the brief summary of that, give you an idea of it, there's a few films on there. A film called Roundup, another one called The Red and the White, and then The Confrontation, Winter Wind, Red Psalm, Electra, not the Daredevil person, and then My Love. But this is a brief summary of the box set. I won't read all of it, but some of it. Screenwriter and director Miklos, however you pronounce his last name, was the creator of a unique film language centered around his mastery of the tracking shot, the first international recognized representation of modern Hungarian filmmaking. His extraordinary works examined impressive authority and the mechanics of power. So looks very interesting. I'm always interested in filmmakers I know nothing about, but that are really well acclaimed. I'm really interested in filmmaking from other countries, especially ones that I've seen very little to none of, and that aren't really filmmaking meccas or places that are talked about for filmmaking. So I will probably check that out as well at some point. But the other films I'll mention are Criterion's new July arrivals. I will mention some of them and leave Rosalie to mention the others. But on July 5th, they're going to be releasing a film from Bong Joon-ho, which I will definitely be getting when I have the money to buy it, Okja. And then they're doing a 4K release on July 12th of Raging Bull. That's movie made by Martin Scorsese, or I don't know, whoever that is. And then,
well-known filmmaker.
Yeah, I don't know. Hopefully he makes it big soon. And then The Summertime by David Lean, starring Katharine Hepburn. And then the movie that should be, for people who keep an eye on the Oscars and foreign film nominations and all that stuff, and Best Picture nominations and stuff, the recent Drive My Car, the Japanese film, is getting a release through Criterion. But yeah, all exciting releases, but I know there are two that you wanted to talk about particularly.
Oh, yes. So if you recall, in the past, I've talked about my running spreadsheet that I have of movies that Criterion should release, and they're finally doing it, at least for two of the movies that have been on my list for one time or another. The first one I'll talk about is Devil in a Blue Dress, which is directed by Carl Franklin, and it stars Denzel Washington. This is a fantastic modern film noir that is just wonderful. We have the great source material by Walter Mosley about a hard-boiled detective who is played by Denzel. And this also features some other excellent performances, in particular Don Cheadle. If you've ever seen this movie, you will definitely know that Don Cheadle kind of steals the show. And very excitingly, there is a special feature on this Criterion Blu-ray that I was in the audience for, and that is the conversation between the director, Carl Franklin, and Eddie Muller, who, if you have TCM, you've probably seen. He does a lot of things on that channel. But it was recorded at Noir City in Chicago in 2018, and I was actually in the audience. So That's pretty exciting. And then another one by a beloved female filmmaker of mine, and that's Sofia Coppola's Virgin Suicides, which has, I think, been needing a release like this for quite some time. This was her directorial debut before she really hit it even bigger with Lost in Translation. And a lovely, beautiful to look at, just gorgeously filmed, but tragic story that it might sound weird to say I'm excited to see it on Blu-ray or excited to see it on Criterion, but it's a really well told story, and I am anxious to revisit it. So
I will say sometimes we really need tragic, depressing movies, so I understand.
we do. It's very cathartic, and it has a gorgeous score, and it has, wonderful performance from Kirsten Dunst and others. So yeah, if you haven't seen it, this would be a great opportunity to do so. And then I will transition over to a couple of non-Criterion things that are coming out that I'm excited for, one of which I've talked about on another podcast. So I covered this on the F This Movie podcast some time ago with Patrick Bromley, but Desperately Seeking Susan is coming out on a British label called Final Cut Entertainment, and this is coming out, I believe, in September. They're doing the deluxe edition of this awesome 80s movie that stars Rosanna Arquette, Madonna, Aidan Quinn, and a number of other folks. And if you've never seen it, it's a whole lot of fun, and it's so very 80s, and Madonna is a total icon in it. So Desperately Seeking Susan, finally getting a special Blu-ray release. And finally, Kino is releasing a whole set of films on Blu-ray by Francois Truffaut. Some of these I have, and some of these I don't, but I don't have any of them on Blu-ray. So I think I will eventually be picking this up, even though it always is a little bit of a downer when I'm like, oh, I have half of these already, but I am excited to have them all in one place. So the movies that are going to be on this set are The Bride Wore Black, Mississippi Mermaid, The Wild Child, The Story of Adele H., Small Change, The Man Who Loved Women, and The Green Room. So this is kind of some of his, I guess, not later films, but, beyond The 400 Blows, which is probably the one that most people know. So those are the ones that I am excited to see that will be coming out in the near future. Well, it's just about time to wrap up this episode, so let's talk a little bit about what's coming next. And we have a great little summer preview for you. We're very excited for our June episode, our Pride Month episode, which we will have a guest for. Nora McIntyre is going to be joining us to talk about 3 movies that she has suggested. Nightmare Alley, the original, not the new one, so make sure you're seeking out the correct one. Scarlet Empress, and Walk on the Wild Side. So if you'd like to check out some of Nora's work, you can follow her on Twitter at Notoriously Nora. And she also has a website, notoriouslynora.com, where she writes about films. So if you'd like to get a little sneak preview of what you can expect from her, we would definitely encourage you to do that. Then in July, we're going to be talking about a trilogy that I know Tim discovered last year for the first time and has been close to my heart for a while, and that is the Before trilogy. So Before Sunrise, Before Sunset, and Before Midnight from Richard Linklater. And those will be on the docket for our July discussion. And then in August, we're going to be doing something a little bit different here because that is my birthday month.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to be talking, or I decided that we should talk about movies that came out the summer of my birth. So that was in 1981. So I know for sure we're going to be talking about Blowout and a second movie that we will announce at a future time. So excited about that discussion. And I'm really excited to get to talk to Nora as well about these movies for Pride Month. So thank you so much all for listening. And you can follow us on Twitter at Blu-ray Boutique. You can also follow me on Twitter at Rosalie Lewis.
And you can follow me on Twitter at CinemaPackerOut, where you can find links to my YouTube channel. If you're not already listening to this on my YouTube channel, then check out my Twitter account as well.
And you can also follow our host site at 25YL Media.
And you can check out the website, 25yearslatersite.com, where you can find writings and podcasts and a bunch of all sorts of fun stuff having to do with various forms of entertainment, like film or music or sports or whatever. I do know, like I think I've said previously, they are rebranding at some point. Sometimes at some point that website name will change, but we will inform you of that when that happens.
All right. Until next time, enjoy the summer and enjoy the movies. We'll talk to you soon.
Con la frente marchita, la nieve del tiempo platearon mi sien. Sentir que es un soplo la vida, que 20 años no es nada, que febril la mirada y errante en la sombra te busca y te nombra vivir. Con el alma aferrada a un dulce recuerdo que lloro otra vez.